Hi again. The last lesson focused on discrimination. This lesson will be oriented toward prejudice. Refer to page 7 in your second study guide and also chapter 9 in the text. A reminder, prejudice is literally a set of attitudes, prejudgments, with often a lot of psychological and emotional investment, often negative in nature, about individuals, groups, and categories. On the 7th page of your study guide, spend some time focusing on the major characteristics of prejudice. I'm going to add an additional one to the list that you see on that 7th page. First and foremost, you want to remember that no one is born prejudiced. This is something that is acquired. It's learned. A child learns fairly early what behavior is going to result in either approval or disapproval. And gradually he or she is going to learn to incorporate into his or her behavior and value system what's considered to be the accepted ways, be it behavior or thinking. Prejudice is basically an outcome of social experience. These are attitudes that are learned in the process of literally growing up. And in part, prejudice may be supported by the human tendency toward social conformity. But bear in mind again, nobody is born with prejudices. How do you think you learned your prejudices? Some might very well have been the result of direct action. On the other hand, some of it might have been subtle. I think all of you would agree with me there are certain environments or settings where we are deliberately encouraged to think of our particular ways in a prejudicial fashion. It might be religion, it might be national character. On the other hand, I suspect all of you, like me, have heard a wide variety of ethnic and gender-based jokes. We laugh at these because they're funny, but again, we can learn prejudices via them. Also, you want to remember that most folks are unaware of their prejudices. They are not to them prejudices, but they have become literally facts. And what's very interesting is that there are a number of studies that highlight the almost unconscious nature, the implicit biases associated with prejudice. For example, I looked at a study the other day involving several hundred doctors. These doctors viewed videos of African American and white patients. All of them, unknown to the doctors, were actually actors. In the videos, each patient complained of identical chest pain and other related symptoms. The doctors were then asked to indicate whether they thought the patients needed cardiac catheterization. Interestingly enough, African American patients were less likely than white patients to be recommended for the procedure. Now the quick question would be, why? Well, it's possible that some of the doctors were deeply prejudiced toward African Americans. But more often than not, and more likely, is that a factor that played a role in this is unconscious biases affecting the judgments of these doctors. Lately, researchers have focused quite a lot of attention on what's referred to as implicit biases. In other words, some biases are literally, again, at a subconscious level. Now, there's a website I want to encourage all of you to take advantage of. I'll leave this up for a bit so that if you want to, you can write it down. Going back to the point I made before, some biases are more implicit. I mean by that they exist at almost a subconscious level, not at a conscious level. And some recent research suggests that we learn a lot of our prejudices at a rather deep unconscious level, and we respond to people very quickly through assessments that are literally not necessarily rational in their orientation. At the unconscious level, we may very well be acting on well-known stereotypes and deeply held prejudices. So if you go to this site, again, this gives you a chance to measure some of your attitudes and beliefs, maybe some that you might be unwilling to admit or even unable to admit that you have. And again, these are a series of really fascinating tests. So I encourage you to, again, take advantage of this if you have an opportunity. And in a way, I suppose that we can let Calvin help us out a little bit. Again, you want to remember that most of us are not aware of our prejudices because in our own mind, these are facts. At the same time, I want you to bear in mind something else. And that is that prejudice is learned through contact with prejudice, not through contact with other people, categories, or groups as such. Put in another way, there's generally very little relationship between the amount of contact a person has had with another group or category of people and his or her attitudes toward that group or category. The attitudes we harbor toward other groups and categories of people are based far more on our contact with attitudes from others around us. Now, if that's confusing, I'll put it this way. We learn prejudices first, long before we ever have contact with the people toward which we direct our prejudices. Hartley's study that is mentioned in your text in chapter 9, it's a classic, illustrates that point graphically. He created 3 imaginary groups, and he included them in a list with other ethnic categories, racial categories, and nationalities. What he discovered, probably no surprise to some of you, is that people who disliked Jews, African Americans, Latinos, Indians, etc., they also disliked, guess what? Those 3 imaginary groups. So we learn prejudice first, long before we ever have contact with a group or a category of people toward which we hold prejudices. Now, you also want to bear in mind that prejudices are unrelated to reality. Specifically, what I'm getting at here is prejudices don't have to make sense. They simply do not bear any real relationship to the real characteristics of a group or a category of people. Once you and I pick up a prejudice, by and large, we're put into a position where we're going to start looking for anything that will confirm that prejudice. And it doesn't have to be very much. It can be just that little bit. What some researchers highlight is the fact that this is a process known as circular reinforcement. In other words, our prejudices are so intense, we're able to interpret any evidence in such a way as to confirm the prejudice. Now, there's an example of this I want to highlight from American history. Some of you are aware of the fact that in 1942, the federal government passed what was referred to as Order 9066. It designated a Pacific military zone. Now, you'll see it right here. Okay? And again, it removed from that zone any folks that were considered to be a potential threat. Now, the whole orientation of the law was to rid this area of any people of Japanese ancestry. Well over 100,000 were affected, and more than 2/3 were native-born Japanese Americans. They were sent to a series of internment camps, basically concentration camps, with armed guards, barbed wires, the whole kit and caboodle. The furthest to the east that these camps were located was in the southeastern corner of Arkansas. But you'll notice again, there were big ones set up in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and several again in the desert and mountainous areas of California. 4 to 5 families were crammed into relatively small tar paper barracks. And interestingly enough, the law itself was kept on the books even after the war. And the key thing was, if you'll focus again on this set of photographs, was the idea that Japanese Americans couldn't be trusted. Push comes to shove, they're going to side with Japan. They might form a fifth column here in the United States and engage in acts of sabotage. In other words, using modern lingo, they were going to become terrorists. And the general who was in charge of the internment program was once asked about the wisdom of interning by force Japanese Americans. And you want to remember, these Japanese American families only had 2 weeks to gather their goods. They could only take what they could carry. Many were put in a position where they had to sell everything that they owned and then live for 3, 4, or more years in these faraway internment camps. Well, when DeWitt was asked about the wisdom of the program, he made a fascinating statement that illustrates the fact that prejudice can be highly irrational. The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such actions will be taken in the future. Now, if that doesn't make a lick of sense to you, that's my whole point. What the guy was actually saying is that the lack of sabotage is evidence of disloyalty on the part of Japanese Americans. He also made this observation: a Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is a citizen or not. So circular reinforcement is going to enable one with prejudices to find in any group or category whatever traits his or her prejudices prompt he or she to look for. And once they're found, that's all that it takes. I told you so. Likewise, bear in mind that prejudice exists in part because it's satisfying. People get off on it. They can gain direct benefits, emotional satisfactions. Prejudice may serve as an excuse for failure, an outlet for aggression or hostility. It might help to provide a sense of superiority, and it can certainly be useful in the struggle for limited resources when groups and categories are competing for them. And you also want to remember that prejudice attaches to groups and categories, not necessarily to individuals. A good example of this, highlight again the era of slavery in the United States. There were field slaves, but there were also house slaves. Some of these house slaves were given very important duties, such as nurturing the children of the owner. They became a part of the family, although the family itself, the white family, harbored strong prejudices toward Africans as a category. As a matter of fact, some of these house slaves were even given quasi-kinship terms or titles, like aunt and uncle. Even today, you can find remnants of this by visiting any grocery store. If you want rice for dinner tonight, you'll buy Uncle Ben's. If you want pancakes in the morning, you might get pancake fixins and syrup known as the Aunt Jemima brand. Likewise, there's something else I want you to remember about prejudice. Prejudice and discrimination are not always found together. Merton highlighted this in his famous typology. Take a moment, reflect on this. An active bigot is one who is prejudiced and at the same time discriminatory, and may very well be proud of it. A white owner of an apartment complex dislikes anybody of color and refuses to rent to them, and thinks he's doing the right thing. The all-weather liberal, on the other hand, works to be neither prejudiced nor discriminatory. An example of this might be someone who holds no stereotypes, or at least tries to restrict stereotypes toward other races and ethnic categories, and works very hard to treat everyone equally. Timid bigot, on the other hand, is someone who is prejudiced but doesn't discriminate. A good example of that is a film made by Spike Lee. Some of you might have seen it, Do the Right Thing. It's set in a neighborhood in New York that was once populated by Italian American families. Many of those have moved to other areas of the city, and large influx of African American families followed. Well, the focus of the film is on this gentleman and his family who run a pizzeria in what is largely now an African American neighborhood. Spike Lee plays in the film as a delivery person. And what's very interesting is the family harbors deep-seated prejudices toward all African Americans, often referring to African Americans using the N-word. Yet, he and his family don't refuse service to them because that would be economic suicide. On the other hand, the fair-weather liberal is someone who's not prejudiced but does discriminate. A store owner, for example, who might think it's wrong to treat minorities worse than whites, but still refuses them service because the owner fears he'll lose his white customers. Or you can put it another way. You work at a restaurant as a server, and the boss comes to you and tells you to mistreat any minority patrons because he doesn't like them or she doesn't like them. And you look at the boss and say, I really can't do that. And then the boss gets in your face and says, do it or you're fired. So remember, discrimination and prejudice are often found together, but not always. We'll carry further our discussion of discrimination and prejudice in the next lessons.